Good morning. Welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class for June the 14th. We're going to be covering two chapters again today. It'll be chapters 12 and 13 of 2 Kings. Verse 1, in Jehu's 7th year as king of Israel, Joash reigned in Jerusalem, and he reigned for 40 years. Verse 2, Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now, verse 3 is a qualification for verse 2 that we just read. It says, only the high places they did not take away. Out of 20 kings of Judah, only 3 took away the high places. Joash was not one of them. The first one was in 1 Kings 15, Asa. And then in 3 weeks, we'll be studying 2 Kings 18. It'll be Hezekiah. And then chapter 22 of 2 Kings will be Josiah. Those are the only 3 kings of all the 20 kings of the Judah that took away the high places. Verses 1 through 3 that we've just read comes out of the regime of Athaliah that we studied last week from chapter 11, and all the tyranny that went on during her 6 years of reign was just horrible. And now a 7-year-old descendant of King David is going to be sitting on the throne. He begins to reign at this time, and we're going to see the covenant still works. It looks like in the eyes of the human that things are pretty shaky. This Joash at 1 year old, when he's taken into hiding, is the only descendant left of King David that could follow the promise of God, that there would always be one of his descendants. Then, of course, after he becomes king at 7, it's going to be a few years where he marries and has children. So again, he's the only descendant left, and none have been born to take his place. But God's promises are always true. The bulk of 2 Kings chapter 12 is in 2 but unequal parts. The first part is refurbishing the temple. That's in verses 4 through 16. 13 verses. And then the second section is depleting the temple in just 2 verses, verses 17 and 18. The first section, however, Josiah gives orders to the priest, and it's recorded in verse 4. Collect all the money that is brought as sacred offerings to the temple of the Lord, the money collected in the census, the money received from personal vows, and the money brought voluntarily to the temple. Priests were to take these funds and they were to make sure that the repairs of the temple were being taken care of according to verse 5. You know, as things often go slow in the church in 2020, they also went slow at times under the covenant. Joash had given those orders, I don't know exactly when, but pretty early in his reign as king. And a number of years later, I don't know why it took him so long, but he came and checked to see how the progress was going. And he found that no repairs had been made. That's according to verse 6. And so he calls in Jehoiada, the high priest, and several other priests, and he asked them why the delay of repairing the temple. And apparently he wasn't satisfied with their answer, because in verses 7 and 8, he goes to plan B. He bypasses the priest with the money that's collected, and he takes away all their responsibility for repairing the temple. And then in verse 9, it says they installed a box with a hole cut in the top where sacred offerings could be placed. And then as that box would begin to fill, the court scribe and the royal scribe and the high priest would count the money, and then they would put it in bags and then deliver it. That's verse 10, and deliver it to the construction supervisor. He would pay the carpenters, the masons, the stone cutters, and of course that money was also used to purchase the material of wood and stone that were used in the repairs of the temple. Get down to verse 15. I see that as an encouraging verse. It says something like the financial accounting of the money for the repairs of the temple were not required of the construction supervisors because they were completely honest. Isn't that neat? A group of men that were honest in the sight of God. Whenever you think about uh, Joash, being the king of Israel, one of the first things he does, he commands that the temple be repaired. And later he notices it's not being done. And so he comes up with a new tactic for collecting the money and for who repairs the temple. And you find more about this successful repair of the temple in a parallel passage of 2nd Chronicles chapter 24, if you want to read that at some time and additional information. But during this time, Joash does not learn the deep things about his faith in God. When Jehoiada, the high priest, died, who had been the mentor of Joash for all his life, he gave his permission for those who lived outside of the city of Jerusalem to return to worship in the high places. And of course, that brought on attacks from the king of Assyria that the Lord allowed to take place. It just all seems, according to verse 17, to fall apart at that point. In fact, threats were made by the king of Syria, to upon Jerusalem. And unfortunately, Joash prefers bribery rather than battle. It says in verse 18, Joash, king of Judah, took all the sacred objects with which Jehoshaphat and Jehoram and Ahaziah, his fathers, the kings of Judah, had consecrated, and his own sacred objects, and all of the gold found in the treasures of the house of the Lord and in the king's house, and sent it to Hazael, king of Syria. And he went away from Jerusalem. Forking over these treasures of Judah, the temple of God and the palaces of the kings, was never a good thing to do. But unfortunately, a number of the kings of Judah did that. Rehoboam, the first king of Judah, Asa, and Joash, as we see today, and then Ahaz, and then even Hezekiah. To me, these are all previews of what was going to happen one day to Judah by the nation of Babylon. Whenever you look at the things that Joash was doing, he was not learning the deep things about faith in God. There were things that he could have done rather than bribery, and should have done. One of those things would have been just inquire of God. We've been threatened by Syria. Lord, what shall we do? But his faith was too shallow. His faith was only considering what he himself could do rather than what the Lord God of Israel could do. In verses 20 and 21, we have the report of Joash's death, and it comes by assassination. 2 of his own officials put him to death. A lot more is told about this death of Joash in the parallel passage of 2nd Chronicles, chapter 24. But Joash's story began on such a positive, beautiful note from chapter 11, how he was the one who was preserved for the line of David. And then his reign featured his wonderful renovation of the Lord's temple in chapter 12, verses 4 through 16, as well as chapter 24. And then in verses 7 and 18, we have the disappointment of his using bribery against the threats of the king of Syria. And then in verses 20 and 21, we have the death of Joash by in chapter 13, verse 1, it begins with the fulfillment of a promise that God had made for Jehu. And it was recorded back in chapter 10 and verse 30, which says that he would have a dynasty of 4 generations because of his following the instructions of God to wipe out the house of Ahab. The end of verse 1 says, Jehoahaz, son of Jehu. He's the first leg of that fulfillment of that prophecy. The faithfulness of God holds the history of Israel together during these days. Chapter 13 covers the reigns of Jehoahaz and also Jehoash. This will be approximately from 814 to 781 BC, which had been a period of about 33 years. Verse 1 says, Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, continues the practice of worshiping the golden calves in Bethel and Dan. The sins of Jehoram, Jehoram is the son of Nebat. That's recorded in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 25 and following. This was idol worship, and the worship of other gods just really ticks God off. It causes him great anger against the people who were not following him as they should. Under Jehoahaz, the idol worship results in Israel being attacked by Syria on a regular basis. In verses 1 and 2, we see that Jehoahaz is a devout follower of Jehoram. This is no surprise because all 20 kings of Israel, each and every one, followed in the paths of his house. And in verse 3, God's wrath is turned great against Israel. And so he gives them in the hands of Hazael and his son Ben-Hadad. And we're surprised then at Jehoahaz in verse 4, very first part, he pleaded with the Lord. Even more surprising is the next phrase in verse 4, and the Lord listened to him. Why did the Lord listen to Jehoahaz, an evil king of the northern tribes? Verse 4c says, for he saw the oppression of Israel, how the king of Syria oppressed them. So Jehoahaz asks God for a favor, and God responds. His response is he causes Syria to quit attacking the northern 10 tribes. And thus they have, for a while, a period of peaceful existence. But the worship of the golden calves did not shut down. Verse 6. Only they did not turn from the sins of the house of Jeroboam. Whenever you think of their faith, it was too weak to cause them to quit worshiping idols. A weak faith because they that faith became active only when they were in the time of crisis. The warmth of God's pity, the warmth of his mercy did not cause them to turn from their infidelity. And in verses 10 through 13, we turn from Jehoahaz to his son Jehoash. And in 4 verses, his whole reign is given to us in the summary form. Verse 10, he reigns for 16 years. Verse 11, he too committed the sins of the house of Jeroboam. And then in verse 12, it talks about a very mighty battle that Jehoash won against Amaziah, a king of Judah. And he destroyed 600 feet of the wall of Jerusalem. He takes many hostages back into Samaria and does much in stealing from the temple of God as well. And then verse 13, his obituary. Joash rested with his fathers. He was buried in Samaria. So in 4 verses, we have Jehoash's beginning all the way to his end. Whenever you think about this faith of Jehoash, it was rewarded by God. But he had an ignorance toward the history of faithfulness. And this, of course, limits his victories to only 3, far less than a complete victory that he needed over Syria. His faith is kind of reminiscent of many times in the generations previously of God's people. For example, under Moses, not long after they left Egypt, they came to the borders of the promised land, and Moses sends over 12 spies. And as they look at the land, they see the greatness and the abundance of that land. As God said, it flowed with milk and honey. But 10 of those spies did not see the victory that God promised over the people who lived in that country. So the nation of Israel had to be in the desert for 40 years because of their lack of faith. None without faith was able to enter into the promised land. So Elisha here in 2 Kings chapter 12 is expecting a true faith to have caused Jehoash for the things with the arrows to throw them to the ground and to have great excitement over the promise that God had made to have victory over Syria. But instead, Jehoash's faith is tentative because of his ignorance. It's kind of interesting, this story that I just began to share with you from chapter 13, verses 14 through 19, is told to us after the death of Joash. It seems that the writer selects this one episode as being a very supreme moment. What happened was Elisha wanted to give help to Joash in his Jehoash in his difficulty with Syria. And so whenever he goes to Elisha, Elisha tells him to take his bow and his arrows and to shoot through a window toward the east. In fact, Elisha helps him do this. And then Elisha interprets what that meant. In verse 17, he says, an arrow for the Lord, an arrow of victory over Aram. So you shoot an arrow for the Lord, that's a victory over Aram or over Syria. And then you shoot another one, and as the time goes, and the prophet orders Jehoash to strike the ground with his arrows. And verse 18 tells us he strikes it 3 times with his arrows. And then verse 19 says that Elisha is furious with Jehoash because he says, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. And because of the king's response of only 3 times to strike the arrow to the ground, Syria would not have a complete victory over Syria. In verse 7 of chapter 13, we see the lament of Jehoash over the devastation of his army during the reign of his father. And his faith leads him to go to Elisha. And of course, that faith is rewarded by granting him victory against Syria. But his ignorance of the history of the faithfulness of the generations of the people gives him far less of a complete victory. The text here really shares with us a value judgment, which is a man's response to the Lord's word is more significant than all the achievements and all the honors that he might receive in a lifetime. Jehoash's response to the Lord was obviously inadequate. He had the Lord's promise in verse 17 of a complete victory. He should have grasped it with both hands, but Jehoash was content to be a 3 victory man. He was saying, in effect, let's don't destroy Syria, let's just contain it. The promise of God did not stir him enough to go for a complete victory. There is faith in these 3 kings that we have talked about this morning. Joash had a faith, but it was shallow. He allowed the people after Jehoiada's death to go back out into worship in the high places. And his faith was also shallow because when he was in trouble with the king of Syria, he depended on what he could do rather than on what the Lord could do. And Jehoahaz's faith was seen only in the time of a crisis. And as soon as the crisis was over, as well as the rest of the time of his reign, his faith led Israel to worship the golden calves in Bethel and in the city of Dan. Jehoash's faith caused him to seek God. That was wonderful. But his ignorance about the faithfulness of God and God's promises was unfortunate. So we have a king that has a shallow faith. We have a king who has a faith only in a crisis. We have a king that has faith only that is ignorant toward the faithfulness of God. What kind of faith do I have? What kind of faith do you have? The remainder of the chapter specifies three provisions the Lord gives to Israel. Verses 20 and 21, he gives them hope. Elisha had died and they buried him, and then text says Moabite raiders came into the land. And when that happened, they took this man that they were burying and pitched him into Elisha's tomb. And when his body touched the bones of Elisha, this man became alive and he stood up on his feet. See, even when Elisha is dead, life is still available. It's still possible for the people of Israel. So Israel has hope. And second, they have the covenant. In verses 22 and 23, we see the oppression of Hazael over Israel. And when that is happening for so long, you wonder why Israel still stands. Verse 23 says, Now the Lord showed grace to Israel, had compassion on them, and turned to them on account of the covenant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was not willing to destroy them, and had not thrown them from his presence until now. Verse 23 is a call to gratitude and repentance. Verse 23 is a call for a complete return to the Lord's covenant for his people. And then third, we see his truth in verses 24 and 25. When Hazael died, his son Ben-Hadad became king. Verse 24. Then verse 25, then Jehoash, son of Jehoahaz, took again the cities from the hand of Ben-Hadad, son of Hazael, which he had taken from the hand of Jehoahaz, his father, in battle. And 3 times Jehoash struck him down, and he recovered the cities of Israel. So the prophecies of verses 17 and 18 come true, as Elisha had assured Jehoash they would. 3 victories and no more. But they still have hope. They still have the covenant. And they still have the truth of God. And unfortunately, they're going to go to judgment, weighted down with the mercies of the Lord. Next week, we'll look at chapters 14 and 15 of 2 Kings.